Today on Fear and Greed, Donald Trump imposes big tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, triggering a trade war likely to lift global inflation. The local auction market stalls in January, with the big two cities of Melbourne and Sydney going backwards, and Microsoft warns of deepfake audio content being used ahead of the federal election. Plus, local markets on edge ahead of the Trump-induced trade war, and the EU cracks down on online retailers like Amazon and Temu, trying to stop fakes. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It is Monday, the 3rd of February, 2025. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Massive news day today, Sean. The main story this morning, Donald Trump has levied large tariffs on imports from Canada, from Mexico, and from China, triggering a trade war that's likely to push prices higher globally. This is a globally significant story.
It could be the biggest economic story of the year, and I'm not overstating it. The president issued an executive order putting 25% tariffs on Mexican goods going into the US, on Canadian goods, with the exception of Canadian oil and energy products. That gets a 10% tariff, and 10% tariff on Chinese goods. That's on top of the tariffs that are already existing. Now, the reason that there's a carve-out for Canadian oil and energy products is that Canada is the biggest supplier of oil to the US, and the White House said the lower tariff for Canadian energy aims to minimise the disruptive effects. Mr. Trump said he used emergency powers to issue the tariffs, and I quote, "because of the major threat of illegal aliens and deadly drugs killing our citizens, including fentanyl." He has always pushed that fentanyl is entering the US via Mexico and Canada, and he blames China for the production of it. A White House official later on said that tariffs would be lifted as soon as, and I quote again, "Americans stop dying from made in China, distributed by Mexico and Canada fentanyl." Industry groups and economists condemned the decision pretty much immediately. It will raise prices for many American families. It'll upend supply chains. There's predictions of big job losses and much higher inflation. Mr. Trump has also said he's likely to levy tariffs on European Union goods. Canada and Mexico were quick to say they're going to introduce tariffs on US goods. China said it will take the United States to the World Trade Organization. We are in the midst of a trade war, Michael.
Yeah, we certainly are. Now, Sean, we talk so much about tariffs and we talk about the percentage, the increase. How does it work, though, then, on the ground? Can you give me an example of how it actually then plays out? And I suppose then what the impact is on consumers, kind of where does this money have to come from?
Okay, so Mexico exports about $35 billion US dollars worth of cars to the US, made in Mexico, sold in the US. Let's say it's $10,000 for a car to be purchased in the US. So a car dealer might buy it for $10,000 off a Mexican manufacturer. Fair enough? Mm-hmm. From tomorrow, that $10,000 becomes $12,500. Okay, extra 25%. The argument is that the car makers in the US, based in Michigan, around Detroit, they'll benefit, create jobs, because suddenly the Mexican car is $12,500. So the home car industry will be much more competitive. It's true. They're competing against a more expensive car. They will be more competitive, but they only need to buy a car, or they only need to create a car for $12,499 to make it cheaper than the Mexican car. You with me so far?
I am following the big question.
Okay.
That I'm just hearing you say this. I'm going, but still,
so
it's more expensive, right?
Who pays that $12,500 or who pays that $12,499? Consumers. You can't get away from that.
Yeah.
It's actually propping up a less efficient industry in the US. And in the end, consumers pay for it. That's why it's inflationary. And this is going to happen across hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods. Might be good social policy. Fentanyl is an absolute scourge on society. Maybe it's good social policy, but it is awful economic policy. Up until about 10 years ago, until 2016 Trump, but it was probably happening a little bit before Trump administration won, the world was pushing really hard into what they call multilateral trade deals, basically allowing free trade. Australia's had all these free trade deals and that, we're pushing really hard. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump stopped that. This turns it on its head and everything gets more expensive.
It's almost a hard one then to sell politically, you would think, even for someone who is as skilled at that as Donald Trump is, because you're expecting then the patriotism of consumers to trump their need and desire to buy cheaper goods, right? Because inevitably they will end up paying more for these things.
In the end, hip pocket matters, and Donald Trump risks creating enormous inflation in the US, and people will turn on him if that's what actually happens.
It's an extraordinary development. Sean, the next logical flow-on question here, and I don't mean to bring it all back to us here, but what does it mean for Australia?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in many ways, it depends on the response of Canada, Mexico, and China. Canada and Mexico have always said we're going to put tariffs on, so all of a sudden, all those goods become more expensive. No one wins in that. I mean, it really shows that being a friend of the US in a Trump world is no safeguard. No one is closer to the US than Canada. So there's that. It shows that Trump will use economic policy, tariffs, to get what he wants on social issues. I'm not sure whether Australia gets affected by that. It makes, I mean, the flip side, though, is it makes Australia, we're not putting tariffs on Canadian or Mexican goods, a kind of a more attractive place for those countries to sell goods compared to the US. Now, I mean, if we were going to use the Mexican-made car as an example, maybe the freight would be too expensive, but kind of there'd be, a bunch of agricultural products that potentially we might get cheaper now because they're not selling them into the US. So that actually might be a good thing for Australia. The biggest fear is what it means to global trade overall. If it slows global trade, if it slows the flow of goods, it means people aren't making as much money. China's not making as much money. China spends a lot of money on Australian stuff. That's where we really, really do get hurt because we're an exporting nation. So to big jump in global inflation, that would certainly give the Reserve Bank pause when it meets next month. It creates enormous uncertainty around the Australian dollar, around bond markets, around equity markets. And even the fact that the White House said, we'll change, they said these tariffs will last until we solve the fentanyl problem. I'm paraphrasing there, right?
Yeah.
But kind of something like that. So does that mean that these tariffs are only here for 3 months and that's just a warning and then they'll get rid of them? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, there is no set timeline for this.
No.
At all.
No.
So, okay, speaking of uncertainty, you mentioned equity markets. How do you think the local market will react today?
It'll be going to be really interesting to see how some of Australia's biggest companies go. So Rio Tinto, it mines aluminium in Canada, sells it into the US. This ain't going to be good for them. BHP, huge potash operations in Canada. If that sells potash, which is a fertilizer, into the US, that's going to be hit. Northern Star, the gold miner, probably falls into a similar category. It's going to be really interesting to see how their share prices perform this morning. Another interesting one is Aristocrat Leisure. It's an Australian company, huge gaming machine manufacturer. It's got a big facility near Vegas. What happens to it? James Hardie, it manufactures plasterboard in the US and other places. How will that fare? Who knows? It's going to be a very, very interesting few days. Now, the market futures is suggesting our local market will be down more than 1% today. Last week, it actually closed off at a record high. So mining, real estate and tech stocks did really well at the end of last week. The bourse finished at 8,532 points, which is the record closing high, up 4.5% for the month. So all things considered, it's probably not going to be a great day, but we just don't know. We just don't know.
Yeah, there's more of that uncertainty, Sean.
Yeah. Hey, can I give you an economics lesson about January? I mean, everything else has swamped this, but Shane Oliver talks about this. So I've got to tell you. Yeah, right. Yeah. So the saying goes, as goes January, so goes the year. So since 1980, 85% of years where there's been a positive January have gone on to a positive year in the US, 76% in Australia. There you go. So we had 4.5. We had a really positive January. So it does augur well, though the world's a different place.
Yeah. So as goes January, so goes the year. What do you have a trade war in February though? So suddenly just
that's right.
A little bit wonky after that though, Sean. Is there anything else? It feels like we've covered a lot. It feels like we've covered a whole show's worth of content already. But
I think so.
While we're talking about international markets, is there anything else going on that we need to chat about?
The interest rates around the world at the moment are pretty interesting. US Fed are on hold at the moment, but the ECB in Europe, Bank of Canada, Swedish Central Bank, they all cut rates last week. Now, what's happened in the last 36 hours may make a bit of a difference. We're actually in the middle of Wall Street's earnings season. About a third of the companies have reported, 78% have beaten expectations, a bit better than normal. But really, what has happened on tariffs will dominate markets, not just for the next few days, but I dare say for most of the year.
Sean, for investors, we've got a really interesting interview coming up today, and that is with Ryan Phillips from Bell Financial Group.
We talked to him about two specific types or cohorts of investors who are very different but really interesting. The first are day traders. People try and make money every day from trading. And the second are high net worth individuals. They're much more likely to take a longer term time frame. People with a lot of money investing, and Ryan works with both sides. So he talked to him about their strategies, how they do it. It's really fascinating.
It sure is. It is coming up after the show. We still have plenty more to get through, though, Sean. We're talking about the local auction market, that warning from Microsoft about deepfake audio, which is fascinating, particularly for the podcast industry, don't you think?
Yeah.
And also the EU taking on Amazon and a few of the big kind of global e-commerce players. Fascinating stuff. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Australia's home auction market has stalled with no growth in January across the country, and Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra all going backwards.
Even the boom cities of Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane are taking a breather, albeit they're still rising. The regions, however, having a much better time of it. That's thanks to internal immigration and healthier affordability. That pushed up the average price across the regions, across the country, by 0.4% last month, as opposed to 0.0% for the capital cities. CoreLogic's Home Value Index is now down 0.3% since the peak in October. The good news is that we have rate cuts coming. We think, we have to put parentheses around these things now, that tends to support house prices. What's interesting, I find, so the median price of a house in Sydney is now 1.2 million. Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth are all about the same now, about 800,000. So Melbourne used to be more expensive, but Adelaide and Perth have been on a tear. Melbourne's gone backwards. So the median house price in those three cities are about the same. Brisbane's actually 900,000, more expensive. Canberra's more expensive at 850. Hobart is the cheapest. Now, over the weekend, 1,400 homes went up for auction. The preliminary clearance rate came in at 65%. I suppose the most notable thing over the weekend was the pickup in Sydney's preliminary clearance rate. But certainly, the housing or the home auction market has come off the boil.
I mentioned this next story before, Sean. Microsoft has warned that deepfake audio content could be used to mislead voters and disrupt the federal election later in the year.
Are you a fake, Michael? Am I speaking to a fake?
Are any of us real, Sean?
That's right.
Just got
out there.
Fear and greed goes deep. This is quite something. No, look, I can assure anyone listening that you and I are both real. Which is exactly what someone who isn't real would say. Please go on.
Yep. I am. Microsoft said that manipulated audio content and deepfake videos designed to sound like a political candidate could spread quickly on social media. Microsoft's Democracy Forward initiative boss, Ginny Badanes, is visiting Australia. She said China, Russia and Iran are among the leaders in electoral interference, often hacking accounts and spreading content to mislead voters, she told the AFR. She said in the most recent US election, it wasn't so much at the presidential level, it was much more at a local level that they were doing that. Auto deepfakes apparently are the most effective at the moment and among the hardest to detect. In a threat assessment published last month, the Australian Electoral Commission said while attempts to interfere in Australia's democratic processes were common, successful interference wasn't so common. However, what Microsoft is now warning is particularly around deepfake audio content, they're more likely to be successful in the run-up to the federal poll, which is due in the middle of May.
This next one's interesting, Sean. National Australia Bank is considering opening branches in shopping centres on Sundays, and they'll extend trading hours to all day on Saturday to more than 24 locations.
In fact, over the weekend, they did have a branch open on Sunday If it does do that, it'll be the first major bank to trade on Sunday in decades. Both Commonwealth and ANZ experimented with opening some outlets on Sundays in the past. NAB said its decision to open branches on weekends was not in response to political pressure, according to the Fin. Instead, it's in the hope of increasing customer satisfaction scores after positive feedback from trials. Labor and the Coalition have pushed banks to keep branches open, although that effort has been focused pretty much on country sites rather than what's happening in the malls and that around the cities. The last time there was significant competition at bank branches on weekends was 2007. That's when Commonwealth Bank pushed into it. ANZ did a bit of it. Westpac and Commonwealth Bank still have branches open on Saturdays, but mostly the weekend is off limits for banks. And it just seems to make sense. In malls, that's when all the people are there. So you'd think that's the best time to service your customers.
Yeah, it has always seemed illogical that banks are only open during the hours when everyone else is working and can't actually get to the bank.
If it's a service industry, you'd think they could do better.
Yeah, indeed. I think we are in furious agreement, Sean. International news time. We've talked a lot about international news already. Just a couple of quick stories. The European Union plans to make e-commerce platforms such as Temu, Shein and Amazon Marketplace liable for dangerous or illegal products sold online.
This is really interesting if you use any of those particular online products. It's part of a crackdown on the flood of imports from China. According to the Financial Times, customs reforms would oblige online platforms to provide data before the goods actually arrive in Europe, in the European Union region. That allows officials better control. What happens at the moment, any individual in the EU who purchases a good online is treated as the importer for customs purposes. So if there's a problem, it's the individual who gets into trouble. The reforms, if adopted, switches that responsibility to the platforms. All this comes amid concerns about the rise in dangerous and counterfeit goods shipped from Asia directly to European customers, and regulators there want to do something about it. I think it's quite an interesting step forward to put the onus on the platforms, not the individuals.
Yeah, it certainly is. One more, Sean. We'll squeeze this one in quickly. Another underwater data cable has been damaged. This is the fourth potential sabotage in the Baltic Sea in the last 18 months. We've been talking about this quite a bit last year. You and I both got a bit obsessed with undersea cables there for a little while.
And these are the cables that basically link the world's internet. So if you cut them, you're cutting the internet. The latest one happened a couple of weeks ago between Sweden and Latvia. Extensive damage, according to reports, probably was deliberate. Now, previously, China and Russia have been linked with damage to undersea cable. At the moment, NATO is deploying drones, submarines, aircrafts in the Baltic Sea to help detect and prevent sabotage. It is a great way of stuffing up a country's communication system, is cutting these undersea cables.
And they really are huge. I mean, and we did talk about it a lot last year. 1.6, just from memory, 1.6 million kilometres of undersea cables. And of that, I think it is Australia owns or controls a quarter just because of our position in the world.
Yeah. Amazing.
Staggering. Unbelievable. All right, Sean, two things coming up next. Number one is the Fear and Greed the week ahead, featuring our resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas. After that, Ryan Phillips from Bell Financial Group, which is, as we discussed before, all about day traders and high net worth individuals, two very different types of investors. It is a great one to listen to if you are interested in investing as well. They're both coming up in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It is Monday, the 3rd of February, 2025. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.